today we will learn about the topic entitled Migration Due to Climate Change from the Indian Perspective. We will first go through the objective of our lecture. Number 1, to understand the term migration and the various aspects related to it. Number 2, to study the cases leading to migration. And number 3, to study about migration in different parts of India. So, migration or population displacement can be driven by climatic hazards such as droughts, hydrologic, storms, atmospheric, and geophysical hazards such as earthquake, volcanic eruptions, and tsunami. The interactions between natural hazard events and social, political, and human factors frequently act to intensify the negative effects of climate and geophysical hazards, leading to political and social unrest, increased social vulnerability, and human suffering. As a consequence of these adverse effects, people migrate from their native land, causing stress, uncertainty, and loss of life and properties. However, such migration can also have positive impacts on migrant lives. For example, migrants may be able to diversify their livelihood and have greater access to education or healthcare. Climate change has been an emerging threat to mankind. To study the nature and consequences of climate change, the United Nations Environment Programme (UNEP) and the World Meteorological Organization (WMO) established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change (IPCC), which was endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly in 1988. Climate change is recognized by IPCC as a significant man-made global environmental challenge and published its first assessment report by IPCC in 1990, following which the UN adopted the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. There is a growing consensus among climate scientists that global warming is taking place, precipitations are erratic, and there is an increase in extreme weather events like flood, droughts, and cyclones globally. In 2020, 30.7 million people from 149 countries and territories were displaced due to different natural disasters. Among them, climate disasters were solely responsible for displacing 30 million people within their own country, with the highest recorded displacement occurring in 2010, when 38.3 million people were displaced. It is difficult to estimate the actual number of people that moved due to the impact of climate change, because people's migration decisions are triggered by a range of contextual factors. Nevertheless, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center (IDMC) states that approximately 283.4 million people were displaced internally between the year 2008 and 2020 because of climatic disasters across the globe. This number represents almost 89% of the total disaster-induced displacement that occurred during this time frame. People who move from their homes due to climate-driven hazards are described in a range of ways, including climate migrants, environmental migrants, climate refugee, environmental refugees, and so on. The process of migration related to climate-driven hazards is variously described as environmental migration, environmental displacement, climate-induced migration, or immigration. we focus on climate-induced migration, most specifically induced by slow onset of climatic disasters like sea level rise, drought, salinity, etc. Rapid onset extreme climatic events like storm, floods, and or both precipitations, erosions, and many more. Climate migration has multifaceted impacts on people's livelihoods. Being displaced from their home, people migrate within their own country, described as internal migration, or across borders to other countries, known as international migration. Internal movements of climate migrants occur mostly to the nearby major cities or large urban centers. Climate migrants who try to move internationally are significantly challenged by two different security problems. Firstly, they cannot live in their own homeland because of worsening climatic impacts and are forced to leave their ancestral land. Secondly, they cannot move to other countries quickly to find a safer place because, according to international law, climate migrants are not refugees and they are not supported by the UN Refugee Convention or any international formal protection policies. Now, there is a range of different causes of climatic migration. This study reveals 19 climate-related causes of migration. We have merged these causes into 8 categories defined as climate change, which includes climate change, global warming, temperature, environmental change, climate-induced natural disaster, meteorological events, extreme weather, heat waves. Secondly, food. Thirdly, sea level rise, which includes melting of glacier. Fourth is drought, which includes desertification. Fifth is storm, which includes cyclone, hurricane, typhoon. Seventh is salinity, which includes tidal surge. Then we have the precipitation-induced landslide. And lastly, we have erosion, which includes coastal erosion and river erosion. Now, climate change is defined as a separate category because some publications have named climate change as an overarching driver of migration rather than specifying any particular hazard. It predominantly identified climate change as the main driver of migration, followed by sea level rise, drought, food, storm, and precipitation-induced landslide. Although it was focused on identifying the climatic causes of human displacement, some other causes emerged during the analysis that also influence migration. Economic, social, environmental, political, cultural, and physiological causes were stated as drivers of migration in addition to the climatic causes. Among these, economic causes have been identified as the most common driver, followed by social and environmental causes. We have also received that political causes and the remainder cultural and psychological causes are also drivers of migration. A range of different impacts caused by climate migration, such as social, economic, political, health, cultural, environmental, and security, have already been described. All the impacts were identified based on the location of climate migrants, which are classified into the following 3 categories. Firstly, impact on the place of origin. Secondly, impact on the place of destination. And thirdly, impact on both origin and destination. The impact of climate migration were more frequently identified for the place of origin rather than for the destination. In the place of origin, the economic, social, and cultural impacts compared to political, security, health, and environmental impacts have already been discussed. So, now with this, we have come to our first quiz. The question is, population displacement is driven by climatic hazard, and the options are emigration, second, immigration, third, migration, fourth, collaboration. Yes, the answer is migration. Now with this we come to the livelihood of climate migrants. A few separate parameters of livelihood, including housing, income and employment, health, access to resources and educations have already been mentioned. The analysis shows that the livelihood of migrants in their place of origin were more likely to be considered compared to their destination. In certain cases, we have seen that the livelihood of climate migrants have been considered both in their place of origin and destination. In total, we have seen that the livelihoods had a specific focus on internal migration and have been mentioned that the livelihoods of climate migrants in terms of international migration. Now, climate change affects migration through a number of socio-economic and political drivers. Some of the people in the areas of climate change decide to migrate and also have the ability to migrate, while others are forced to stay back. The foresight group have argued that this trapped the population, that is, those who do not move are equally important in adaptation and planning for climate change affected people. As climate change induced migration is confounded by a number of socio-economic determinants, it is however difficult to predict. But the fact remains that a large number of people are getting affected by changes in the rising temperature and precipitation, and also extreme weather events like flood, drought, cyclone, and cloudbursts. Desertification and declining crop productivity are slow processes affecting the livelihood of the people and forcing them to seek the option of migration. This may also raise mortality and morbidity levels in the affected population if mitigation and adaptation strategies are not followed, and may derail the efforts to achieve Millennium Development Goals. Migration could be a possible adaptive mechanism, but as several studies on India have shown that migration is a socio-economically selective process. This means that not everybody affected by climate change would be privileged to migrate and settle elsewhere. However, this may likely to increase the seasonal and temporary migration, may intensify impoverishment and malnourishment, and increase the morbidity and mortality level of vulnerable populations. There could be various possibilities, and migration is one that depends upon a number of socio-economic and political drivers. As we have mentioned earlier, climate change influences migration through a number of socio-economic and political factors. The impact of climate change on human mobility could be either rapid as a result of extreme weather events like cyclone, storm, floods, etc., or slow due to desertification, changes in the rainfall pattern, sea level rise, and melting of the mountain glacier. It is agreed in a number of studies that due to interwoven and complex nature of the relationship between climate change and socio-economic and political factors, its influence on migration is difficult to be separated. Also, migration is one of the several mobility outcomes along with displacement and movement of refugees. As mobility outcomes are varied and diverse, each outcome is influenced by nature and the pattern of climate change and socio-economic and political interactions differently. However, the key to the understanding of mobility outcome lies in the opportunity or loss of livelihood and decision to migrate as influenced by vulnerability, aspiration, network, and ability to migrate. The identification of hotspots of climate change vulnerability depends upon existing knowledge on the subject, which is growing in recent years. According to the Asian Development Bank, low-lying coastal areas, deltaic region, and semi-arid areas are the hotspots vulnerable to climate change. Hotspots are defined as specific areas or regions that may be at a relatively high risk of adverse impact of one or more natural hazards as a result of climate change. The West Coast, the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, and the delta of Mahanadi, Krishna, and Godavari in the East Coast, and arid areas of Rajasthan are the hotspots. On the other hand, INCCA considered only 4 regions, namely coastal areas, Western Ghats, Northeast Himalayas, as the hotspot of climate change vulnerability based on biodiversity, and left the Western dryland, which is an important biophysical entity of India. They have also identified drylands, mountainous region, and low elevation coastal zone as areas of hotspots of climate change vulnerability. It is worthwhile to note that the climate change models are still rather imperfect representations of reality and differ considerably in identifying the zones of vulnerability and hotspots. Let us come to some of the hotspots. Firstly, Sundarban, West Bengal. The Sundarban landscape is witnessing higher than the global average of sea level rise, leading to the accelerated land erosion. A recent World Bank study shows that the transboundary Sundarban had a net loss of 450 square kilometer of land from 1904 to 2016. Lohachora, Bedford, and Suparibhanga islands were consumed by the river many decades ago. Ghoramara Island is slowly eroding into the river, with 50% of it already submerged in the last 5 decades due to a combination of land erosion and rising water level. Jammudip lost about 75% of its land area, while Moushumi Island shrunk by 20%. Another study by the Indian Meteorological Department revealed that the number of severe cyclone storms in November, the period having the most high-intensity cyclone, have also increased by about 26% in Indian Sundarban during the last century. The most discerning findings from the World Bank study about cyclone movement dynamics on the Bay of Bengal are the median location of cyclone has shifted eastwards over time, with the highest impact zones currently found in northern Orissa and the Sundarban region of West Bengal. In 2009, when Cyclone Aila hit the Sundarban, it washed away 25% of the houses close to the forest area, where it hit the hardest. Agricultural land became useless due to saltwater inundation, and drinking water sources were contaminated. According to the West Bengal government's internal report, Bulbul affected 3.56 million people and damaged 0.5 million houses. Next we come to Bid, Maharashtra. Bid district is one of the 8 districts of the Marathwada region of Maharashtra. The Marathwada region receives an average rainfall of less than 600 mm, 30% lower than the country as a whole, and as a result is susceptible to drought and is generally characterized by extreme aridity, hot climate, and acute deficiency in water availability. Droughts are a recurrent phenomenon in the state, and therefore migration from this region is a routine according to a study by the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology and the Indian Institute of Science. Between 1870 and 2015, the Marathwada region faced 22 droughts. These were 5 instances of 2 consecutive droughts, the most recent of which were in 2014-15 and 2015-16. Next, we have the Kendrapara, Orissa. The Kendrapara district is a part of the coastal Orissa characterized by a fragile environment prone to flood and cyclone, low and highly variable rainfall, high water deficiency, frequent rainfall failure, and lately also emerging drought-prone districts. The super cyclones, Cyclone Philene and Cyclone Hudhud, have severely disrupted the community livelihoods in this region. Over the decade, Orissa has been experiencing worsening extreme weather conditions, claiming many lives, from heat waves to super cyclones, from drought to flood. Migration in Orissa, which is known as the Dadan system, has been in practice for a long time. People from the tribal and rural Orissa were often recruited by labor contractors and taken to various states of Orissa in the various states of India to work in tea gardens, construction sites, and brick kilns. Next, we have Almora, Uttarakhand, which is one of the multi-hazard prone districts of Uttarakhand. Uttarakhand is an Indian Himalayan state known for its growing frequency and intensity of natural disasters and its fragility of ecological and geological systems. Due to its geoclimatic, ecological, and socio-economic settings, Uttarakhand is one of the most disaster-prone states of the country. The climate is different in different parts of Almora because of the vast difference in altitude. The state of Uttarakhand has 13 districts, out of which 10 are known as hill districts. A sharp rise in migration from the hills to the plain is the biggest problem the state has seen in the last few decades. The report of the Rural Development and Migration Commission released in 2018 says that more than 70% of the migration occurs within the state, indicating the movement of people from the state's mountainous regions to its plains. Now with this, we have come to our second quiz. The question is, which island has lost almost 50% of its land mass to the ocean? The options are A. Lohachora, B. Ghoramara, C. Jammu Dip, and D. Moushumi Island. Yes, the answer is Ghoramara. So, with this we have come to the end of this lecture, where we have learned about migration in India, the various causes that has led to migration based on climatic conditions like drought, earthquake, tsunami, rainfall, droughts. And what we have seen is that these climatic conditions that have caused migration is in specific regions of India, about which also we have studied. And with this we come to the end of our lesson. Thank you.